Morning light drifted over the prairie like a tired prayer, soft and unhurried, touching every blade of grass as though trying to wake the land without startling it. Eliza Whitmore walked through that pale gold hush with the slow steps of a woman, carrying more weight inside her heart than in her hands. Her dress was torn near the hem, dust clinging to the fabric like old sorrow, and one side of her face held the faint shadow of a bruise she had not yet learned to name. She kept her gaze low, not from shame but from a belief that if she looked up, the world would demand something from her she no longer had to give. She had left the Whitmore homestead before the sky even finished turning from indigo to gray, slipping past the warped door while the house slept in its own bitterness. She moved like someone half awake, driven more by instinct than thought, her body remembering the path even when her mind drifted somewhere far away. Behind her, that house of her late husband's family held her newborn son in a cradle she was no longer allowed to touch, a cradle guarded by cold eyes and sharp tongues. Every step she took away from it felt like stepping off a cliff, yet she kept walking, because something inside her whispered that staying would break what little remained of her spirit. The land around her stretched wide and lonely, the kind of open space that made a person feel both free and terribly small. A faint wind carried the scent of warm dust and distant pines, brushing her skin like a reminder that the world could be gentle even when people were not. Her footsteps slowed near the shallow bend of the river, where smooth stones glimmered beneath the clear running water. She knelt there, not to drink but to steady herself, fingertips trembling over the cool surface, as if the river might steady the shaking inside her. Her reflection wavered on the ripples, a face she barely recognized, a woman who had forgotten how to hope without hurting. It was in that fragile quiet that she heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her, a sound too steady to belong to fear and too gentle to belong to danger. She lifted her head slowly, breath caught between ribs, and saw a shadow move with the shape of a mountain. Nakoa Red Elk stepped into the pale morning light as though he had been carved from the very stone of the earth, tall enough to challenge the sky, broad enough to quiet the wind. His bare chest carried the sun like armor, and his long black hair rested over his shoulders in quiet waves. He did not speak at first, simply lowering himself to one knee beside her, studying the tremor in her hands with eyes that seemed to see beyond wounds. Eliza tried to speak, but her voice faltered, trapped somewhere between fear and relief. Nakoa did not press her. He simply reached into the small hide pouch at his side and drew out a strip of cloth soaked with something smelling faintly of herbs. With movements slow as drifting ash, he offered it toward the bruise on her cheek, and she flinched, not from pain but from the unfamiliar feeling of someone touching her with gentleness. His presence was calm, like a river during drought, steady in a way that seemed impossible for a man who looked carved for storms. She drew a shaky breath, letting him dab the cloth against her cheek, the coolness sinking through her skin like a promise she did not yet understand. Words slipped from her in fragments, tiny pieces of truth falling into the space between them. The beatings, the stolen child, the cold faces of the Whitmore family watching her grief as though it entertained them. She spoke not to gain sympathy, but because silence had turned too heavy to carry alone. Nakoa listened with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that most wounds live beneath the skin, unseen yet shaping everything. His gaze did not waver, not when she trembled, not when her voice cracked, not even when she whispered that her newborn son had been taken from her arms the night before. It was only then that a shadow passed over his expression, not anger but something quieter and far more dangerous, resolve settling into bone. A hush settled around them, deeper than the stillness of the river or the whisper of the grass. Eliza felt the weight of his silence not as judgment but as understanding, a rare kind that softened her breath and made her shoulders lower for the first time in months. Nakoa rose slowly, towering above her with a presence that felt less like threat and more like shelter. He extended a hand, open and patient, waiting for her to choose whether she trusted him enough to take it. For a heartbeat she hesitated, remembering every harsh voice and heavy hand she had endured, but something in his eyes, steady, quiet, ancient, pulled her forward. Her fingers touched his palm, trembling at first, then settling into the warmth offered there. That single moment felt like a doorway opening, a shift in the wind that told her she would not walk the next steps alone. Nakoa helped her stand, his touch firm but never forceful, guiding her away from the riverbank, as though leading her from the edge of a memory she no longer wished to drown in. The prairie stretched before them, its amber grasses shimmering beneath the rising sun, and for the first time Eliza felt the faint stir of something she had nearly forgotten: the possibility of safety. They walked in silence, their footsteps forming an unspoken rhythm, her breath slowly matching his steady calm. When they reached a fallen log shaded by a crooked cottonwood, he motioned for her to rest. She sank onto the rough bark, babyless arms folding around her ribs, trying to imagine her child's warmth there instead. Nakoa remained standing, watching the horizon with an expression she could not read, as if searching for an answer carried on the wind. After a long silence, he finally turned toward her, the lines of his face softened by something she could not name. He studied her as though memorizing the shape of her pain, and for a moment Eliza felt exposed under the weight of that attention. Yet instead of shrinking from it, she found herself meeting his gaze, letting him see the truth she had hidden from everyone else. Her voice was a whisper when she said she did not know how to go back, how to face the Whitmore family again, how to fight for a child stolen from her along with her dignity. Nakoa listened, arms at his sides, breath steady, the morning light catching along the edge of his shoulders like a flame. Then, with a calm rising from the roots of the earth, he spoke the words that shifted the ground beneath her. "Pack your things and come with me," he said, not as a command but as a promise. Days unfolded gently in old Maggie Crowder's small cabin, where the scent of drying sage clung to the rafters and sunlight slipped through the crooked window like a shy visitor. Eliza moved through that humble space with the hesitance of someone learning the shape of safety for the first time. Her steps soft, her breath careful, as though the world might shatter if she exhaled too deeply. Nakoa came each morning, silent as dawn itself, carrying bundles of wood or jars filled with crushed leaves that smelled of forest shadows. He never asked how she slept or whether the bruise beneath her eye still throbbed. He simply existed nearby with the steady presence of someone who knew that healing required room to breathe, not questions. Old Maggie watched them both with the tired affection of a woman who had witnessed too many stories unravel and begin again beneath these same wooden beams. She brewed teas that tasted like bitter earth and hope, humming old frontier songs as she worked, yet even she did not interrupt the strange quiet blooming between Eliza and the giant Apache. Eliza found herself studying him in small stolen moments, the way the morning light traced along his shoulders, the way his hands moved with deliberate patience while grinding herbs, the way he seemed to carry more stories in his silence than most men carried in their voices. She had known rough men, loud men, men whose tempers ruled every room they entered. Nakoa was none of those things. His presence felt carved from steadiness, from a kind of gentleness she had never learned to expect from anyone. In the evenings when the sky dipped into colors soft as faded fabric, Eliza would sit near the open door, rocking slowly while her thoughts circled the same painful memory. Her child's cry the night he was taken, the sharp hands that tore him from her arms, the cold eyes of Jed and Martha Whitmore watching her plead. Shame lingered under her skin like an old bruise, but deeper still was fear. Fear that she had already lost too much to ever reclaim what was stolen. Nakoa noticed the way her breath tightened during those moments, though she tried to hide it. He would step outside without a word, letting the fresh air follow him back in, as if inviting the world to soften around her. When he returned, he sometimes placed a carved piece of cedar in her hands, a small gesture, simple as rain on dry soil, yet it grounded her more than any whispered comfort could. One afternoon, Eliza gathered the courage to ask why he came so often, why he lingered in this place of worn quilts and quiet sorrow when he owed her nothing. Nakoa's answer came slow, like a river choosing its path. He said he knew what it meant to lose family to cruelty, to watch helplessness dig its claws into the heart, to be left standing in a world that refused to show mercy. His voice did not rise, yet each word carried the weight of a man who understood grief not as story but as lived truth. His honesty settled around her like a blanket, warm despite its heaviness. She realized then that his silence had never been distance. It was a shield he used to protect what little remained unbroken inside him. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not a spark of romance, not yet, but a quiet recognition, a shared understanding forged from different wounds shaped by similar hands. The shift grew in the following days, subtle as dawn sliding into morning. Eliza began to speak more, her voice gaining strength like a limb rediscovering use. Nakoa listened with the patience of an oak weathering years of wind. She told him of her husband, of the good days when laughter filled their tiny home, and of the darker years when illness crept into his bones and left her standing alone long before death ever came. She confessed her guilt for not fighting harder when the Whitmores took her child. Nakoa did not offer false comfort. Instead, he spoke softly of courage, the kind that survives, not the kind that shouts. But as comfort grew, so did fear. Rumors drifted through town like dust storms. Whispers that Eliza had run away, that she was unfit, that the Apache had taken her for his own reasons. Sheriff Lane Hodge visited the cabin one morning, his boots heavy on the threshold, his gaze shifting between the two of them with a caution that tasted of old prejudice. He warned Nakoa to stay clear of Whitmore affairs. He warned Eliza that her chances of recovering her child would worsen if she was seen under Apache protection. His words bruised more deeply than fists, leaving Eliza trembling long after he rode away. That evening, as the sky dimmed and a restless wind swept across the plains, Eliza fought the urge to crumble beneath the weight of the sheriff's warning. She felt as though every path forward was narrowing, every option slipping through her fingers like dry sand. Nakoa sat near the hearth, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes, his expression unreadable. She watched the glow of firelight catch along his jaw, watched the steady rhythm of his movements, and felt a strange ache rise in her chest, a mix of gratitude, fear, and something warmer she dared not name. Nakoa finally set the blade aside and looked toward her, his eyes dark with thought, as if he had been holding back a truth too heavy. Before she could speak, he rose and stepped closer, the floorboards groaning. He told her that danger would keep circling until she made a choice, to return and surrender, or to stand and fight for the child she loved. His voice was steady, but something fierce burned beneath it, something unspoken. Then he said the words that pulled her breath from her chest. He would not let her face the Whitmores alone. The morning they set out, the prairie felt strangely breathless, as though the land itself held its wind in quiet anticipation. Pale gold light reached across the grasslands, stretching long, trembling fingers toward the horizon. Eliza sat behind Nakoa on the horse, her hands hovering uncertainly before settling lightly against his waist, her touch cautious yet trusting. The leather saddle creaked beneath them as the horse shifted, and Nakoa murmured something low and soothing to the animal, his voice carrying the calm of a man who had spoken more to the earth than to people. They rode slowly at first, letting the rhythm of hooves steady the tension in Eliza's breath. She felt the warmth of Nakoa's back through the thin fabric of his shirt, a steady reminder that she was no longer facing the world alone. Each step forward sent small vibrations through her, grounding her in the simple truth that this journey, however dangerous, was one she had chosen. The path wound between tall grasses swaying like whispers of forgotten stories, and every mile pulled her closer to the place she feared most, the Whitmore homestead, where cruelty had carved new wounds inside her chest. Nakoa remained silent for a long time, but not the cold kind of silence she knew from the Whitmores. His quiet felt intentional, respectful, an invitation for her to breathe freely, to gather her thoughts without pressure. Eliza found herself watching the landscape shift around them, noticing details she had missed before. How sunlight glinted off distant creek water, how the wind carried the faint scent of wild chamomile, how the sky widened above them with an almost aching beauty. It all felt different with him beside her, as if the world softened just enough to let her find strength within its vastness. When they paused near a cluster of juniper trees, Nakoa dismounted first and extended his hand upward. She took it, fingers trembling slightly, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. He reached into one of his saddle packs and pulled out a small piece of dried meat and a skin of water, offering them without words. Eliza accepted, grateful more for the thoughtfulness than the food itself. While she sipped, he stood a short distance away, scanning the horizon with the instinctive alertness of someone who trusted nature more than people. She watched the way his profile caught the sun, sharp and strong, yet softened by the quiet depth in his expression. She had known him only a short time, yet something about him, his steadiness, his patience, the way he listened with his whole presence, felt like shelter. Her voice emerged softly, almost carried away on the breeze, when she finally asked why he had chosen to help her. Nakoa turned, his gaze meeting hers with a gravity that made her heart tighten. He spoke slowly, telling her that no child should be taken from its mother, and no woman should be left to stand alone against cruelty. He said he had seen the fire in her eyes even through pain, and he believed a person with that kind of fire deserved a fighting chance. His words lingered inside her like embers, warming places she thought had frozen over. She lowered her gaze, overwhelmed not by his strength, but by the gentle truth of his conviction. For a moment she let herself imagine a life where people like him existed in greater number, people who offered protection not for ownership but for honor. But the image dissolved quickly, replaced by the familiar ache of fear. Her child still waited beyond the ridge, too small to understand the battle surrounding his existence. Her breath wavered as she imagined the cries he must have made, the tiny fists searching for her warmth. Nakoa saw the shift in her face and stepped closer, his shadow falling softly over her shoulders. They continued riding as the sun climbed higher, turning the land into a shimmering mirage of gold and heat. Eliza rested her cheek lightly against Nakoa's back, steadying herself whenever doubt grew too large. The journey became a quiet sharing of breath and heartbeat. When a sudden cloud of dust rose from a distant hill, she tensed, but Nakoa lifted a hand in reassurance, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. The touch steadied her immediately, not because of its gentleness, but because of its intention. He wanted her to feel safe. Hours later, the Whitmore homestead came into view, standing rigid and unwelcoming against the plains. The familiar outline struck her like a blow, memories surging with painful clarity. The doorway where Martha had sneered at her, the kitchen where Jed's voice had cut her down again and again, the cradle where her baby had once slept under her watchful eyes. She gripped Nakoa's waist a little tighter, the motion revealing her rising panic. He covered her hand with his own, grounding her before she drowned in dread. When they dismounted, the air grew heavy with tension. Jed Whitmore stepped onto the porch, his expression tightening the moment he saw her. Martha hovered behind him with a smirk sharp enough to slice. Eliza felt her pulse hammer against her ribs, but Nakoa stood firm beside her, his presence a barrier stronger than any wall. Jed's voice carried across the yard, dripping with resentment as he accused Eliza of abandoning her place and dared to claim she had forfeited her right to motherhood. Martha added venomous comments about Eliza's weakness, her inadequacy, her inability to provide for a child. Each word struck like a lash, reopening wounds she had barely begun to mend. Eliza lowered her gaze, not in shame but in an attempt to hold herself together. But Nakoa's voice cut through the insults like thunder rolling across an open sky. He stepped forward with an authority that made Jed's bravado falter. He spoke slowly, each word heavy with restrained fire, telling them that no law, no prejudice, no false claim could break the bond between a mother and her child. His voice did not rise, yet the entire homestead seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his conviction. Jed attempted to stand taller, to reclaim his dominance, but the truth trembled in his posture. He feared the man before him. Nakoa held his gaze with unwavering calm, and something in that stillness broke the last thread of resistance. Martha retreated first, muttering curses under her breath, and moments later Jed surrendered with a scowl, calling inside for the infant. Eliza's knees nearly buckled when they placed her newborn into her arms. The world faded into a blur of warmth and tears as she pressed the tiny body against her chest, inhaling the familiar scent that had lived in her memory since the moment he entered the world. Her child's soft murmur filled the space within her that had felt hollow for far too long. Nakoa watched from a few steps away, his eyes softening with something she could not yet name. Holding her baby, Eliza turned toward him with gratitude overflowing from her very bones. But before she could speak, a sharp movement caught her attention. A figure lingering at the corner of the property, watching them with intent too deliberate to ignore. The horse beside him bore the sheriff's saddle mark. Eliza's breath caught, and fear whispered swiftly through her. The man didn't approach, just watched, studying the reunited mother and child as though calculating what power might be taken next. The moment Eliza met his gaze, she felt a chill crawl along her spine, a quiet warning that the battle ahead would not end with this fragile victory. Nakoa followed her line of sight, his jaw tightening as the figure turned away, disappearing into the shimmering distance like a threat carried by the wind. Evening settled over Nakoa's ridge with a softness Eliza had almost forgotten, a hush that wrapped itself around the cabin like a worn blanket, remembering every story ever whispered within its walls. She carried her child close, feeling the tiny breaths warm against her collarbone as she stepped inside the home that had shifted, in a single day, from a stranger's shelter to something resembling a promise. Nakoa followed her quietly, his shadow merging with the dimming light as though he belonged to every dusk the earth ever knew. He set his bow near the doorway, not as a gesture of danger but of responsibility, as if laying down a vow he never needed to speak aloud. Eliza watched him with the quiet awe one feels when witnessing something rare, something carved from a truth deeper than fear. She placed her baby in the small cradle Nakoa had built earlier that afternoon, the wood smoothed by his hands until it gleamed like river-polished stone. The infant settled easily, soothed by the rhythm of a world steadier than the one he had known. Eliza leaned over the cradle, brushing one fingertip along her child's cheek, letting the warmth steady the small tremor that still lived beneath her ribs. Her heart beat with gratitude she could not yet voice, gratitude twined with the fragile fear that this peace might vanish the way all her joys once had. Nakoa tended the fire, coaxing the flames with careful movements that made Eliza think of a man who had learned long ago how to turn solitude into ritual. He sat on the floor rather than the chair, as if honoring the ground that had carried him through so many seasons alone. Eliza joined him, settling a cautious distance away, her dress rustling like dry grass in a late summer wind. For a moment neither spoke. The crackling fire carried their unspoken thoughts into the shadows. It was Eliza who broke the silence, asking in a soft voice how long he had lived on the ridge, though what she truly meant was why. Nakoa answered with measured breath, explaining that he had chosen this place because the land listened better than most men did, and because solitude had never lied to him the way people often had. His words settled over her like smoke, carrying the ache of a history he did not fully share but could not entirely hide. She wondered what losses had carved such quiet strength into him, what ghosts walked beside him when the nights grew cold. As the days passed, their little world began to shift, shaped not by declarations but by the subtle weaving of shared moments. Eliza cooked simple meals, seasoning them with herbs Maggie had given her, while Nakoa repaired the roof, fetched water, and carved small wooden toys for the child who watched him with wide, curious eyes. Sometimes they laughed, soft and uncertain, as though relearning the shape of joy. Other times they sat in silence, comforted by the simple knowledge that neither needed to pretend. The townspeople, however, were not as quiet. Rumors drifted through Dry Creek like dust devils, whispers that the widow had been enchanted by the Apache, that she was living in sin, that the Whitmores would reclaim the child and expose her shame. Eliza heard fragments of those whispers whenever someone passed Maggie's cabin or paused too long at the well, and each murmur wrapped a new strand of fear around her heart. Nakoa noticed the tension building in her shoulders, though she tried to hide it behind small smiles that never reached her eyes. He began staying closer to the cabin in the evenings, pretending to work on repairs though his gaze drifted often toward the ridge road, watching for unwelcome visitors. One night, while the fire whispered low and the baby slept nestled beneath a quilt, Eliza finally spoke the fear she had kept locked behind her teeth. She whispered that the sheriff had been watching her at the Whitmore property, that his silence had felt heavier than a threat voiced aloud. Nakoa listened without interrupting, but the firelight revealed a flicker in his expression, a tightening at the corner of his jaw, as though something inside him had been waiting for confirmation. He told her the sheriff was not a man who acted without motive, and that the Whitmores had likely whispered poison into the lawman's ear. The truth hung between them like a cold draft, chilling the warmth the fire tried to offer. Eliza reached for her child then, lifting him gently and holding him close, as though the contact could shield him from every unseen threat gathering on the horizon. Nakoa rose and stepped toward the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dark, the weight of his decision settling across his shoulders like an old familiar burden. He told her they could not wait for danger to arrive. They must face it before it chose its moment. Eliza felt her breath catch, torn between terror and the strange, steady faith she had begun to place in him. When she asked what he meant, he turned toward her fully, eyes reflecting the fire's restless glow, and said he knew where the sheriff went when he wished to speak privately with men like Jed Whitmore. Nakoa stepped farther into the doorway, letting the night wind wrap around him like a cloak, and he told her in a voice edged with something fierce and deeply rooted that he would ride at first light to learn what schemes were being laid against her, because no mother should be forced to live beneath the shadow of such men. Eliza clutched her child tighter, watching his broad silhouette merge with the darkness just beyond the threshold. And in that moment a tremor ran through her. Not of fear, but of knowing that the path ahead would demand more courage than she had ever been asked to find, and it was already coming for them. Dawn crept over the ridge like a quiet confession, pale and trembling, as though the sky itself feared waking what waited below. Eliza stood at the doorway holding her child, the cool morning air brushing her cheeks, while her thoughts tangled like roots beneath restless soil. Nakoa had left before the sun rose, riding into the hush with the steady resolve of a man who had run from fear once in his life and vowed never to do so again. She watched the horizon for any sign of him, every heartbeat stretching longer than it should, every rustle of wind sounding like a warning. Her child stirred against her chest, soft breath warming her collarbone, grounding her in a world that felt ready to tilt. She whispered soothing words more for herself than for the infant, hoping her voice would not betray the tremor running through her. Hours passed. The sun climbed. The ridge held its silence until the sound of hooves cracked it open like thunder against stone. Eliza's breath stilled, her fingers tightening protectively around her child as Nakoa rode into view, his posture rigid, his expression carved with the weight of something he did not yet speak. Dust clung to him like a second skin, and his horse bore the strain of a journey pushed harder than it should have been. When he dismounted, he reached the door with steps heavy enough to carry trouble behind them. Eliza waited, heart bracing, while he stood before her with eyes that held both fire and sorrow. He told her the sheriff had met with Jed and Martha at the edge of Dry Creek, speaking low and deliberate, discussing not only reclaiming the child but pressing charges that would strip Eliza of every right she fought to reclaim. They planned to ride to the ridge by sunset, using law as a blade sharpened by lies. Eliza's knees weakened beneath the revelation, but Nakoa steadied her with a gentle touch, his fingers brushing her elbow, his voice anchoring her to the ground she feared would crumble. He promised she would not face their cruelty again, not while he had breath left to protect her. Yet even as he spoke, she sensed more behind his words, something unspoken pressing at the edge of his restraint like a storm preparing to break. Together they prepared for what would come. Nakoa secured the cabin door, checked his arrows, and positioned himself like a sentinel carved from patience and danger. Eliza moved quietly, placing her child where the cradle stood closest to the hearth, where warmth would hold him if fear grew too large. She watched Nakoa's silhouette in the shifting light, saw the tension woven into his shoulders, the weight of decisions he had not yet shared. Every moment felt pulled taut, as though time itself held its breath. When the first riders appeared on the distant trail, their shapes flickering through dust and sunlight, Eliza felt her pulse climb into her throat. Sheriff Lane rode in front with the Whitmores behind him, their expressions sharpened by spite, their eyes hungry for victory. The sheriff raised his hand, as if commanding the entire world to still. Nakoa stepped forward with the quiet strength of a man, who knew the land beneath his feet belonged to no law, but the one written by the earth itself. Jed demanded the child. Martha spat accusations laced with venom. The sheriff announced he had the right to take the infant under claims of safety and bloodline. Each word struck like a blow, each claim echoing through the small clearing with the cold certainty of a verdict already written. Eliza stepped beside Nakoa, her fear trembling through her limbs, but her voice steady with a resolve she had not felt in years. She refused to hand over her child. She refused to bend beneath cruelty disguised as justice. The sheriff's expression hardened, and he reached toward his holstered weapon, as though Eliza's defiance was a crime too dangerous to allow. Jed moved with him, confidence blooming in the shadow of law. But before the moment could turn, Nakoa stepped forward with a calm that froze every breath in the clearing. His voice rose not in anger, but in truth, speaking of the night he found Eliza broken near the riverbank, of the bruises that marked more than skin, of the lies whispered by those who feared a woman's strength more than her weakness. He spoke of a mother's right, of a child's bond, of a justice deeper than any paper stamped by men who had forgotten the meaning of mercy. The sheriff faltered beneath the weight of those words. Jed's confidence cracked. Martha looked away, as though witnessing a truth she could no longer bend to her will. The tension broke like a string pulled too tight when the sheriff finally lowered his hand. He could not challenge the truth Nakoa had carved into the air. He could not justify violence against a mother whose suffering stood before him, undeniable and raw. He turned away, muttering warnings that no longer carried the weight they once held. Jed and Martha retreated with bitterness gnawing at their pride, their threats dissolving into the dust behind them. When the last hoofbeat faded, Eliza's breath collapsed in a sob she had been holding for far too long. Nakoa turned to her slowly, exhaustion and something deeper flickering across his face. She stepped toward him, gratitude trembling through her like a new heartbeat. But before she could speak, his voice shifted, softened, took on a tremor she had never heard. He told her he had lived alone for years not because he wished for solitude, but because he had never found a soul he trusted enough to let close. Until her. He told her that watching her fight for her child had awakened something in him he had tried to bury beneath silence. He told her that loving her had begun the moment he saw her broken, yet unyielding, by the river's edge. Eliza felt the world tilt, not in fear this time, but in awe. Nakoa stepped closer, his hand gently brushing the hair from her face, his voice rough with truth as he confessed that he would share his home, his strength, his life, not out of duty but love. She placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady, aching rhythm beneath her palm, and whispered that she had felt safe with him long before she understood why. Their foreheads touched, the world narrowing to breath and warmth and promise. And in that fragile, blazing moment, with the ridge holding its breath around them, the wind carried the distant echo of returning hoofbeats, reminding them that love, even newly spoken, would have to survive what shadows still rode toward them.